Hi, everybody. Dennis Prager here. And as always, thank you for being with me. A very, very bright man whom I read regularly is John Zmirak, Z-M-I-R-A-K, senior editor of TheStream.com, author of, among other books, I might add, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Catholicism. Obviously, a practicing Catholic himself and a serious thinker. He has a great book on immigration, which is the last time I had him on. So, John, welcome back to the Dennis Prager Show.
Thank you, Dennis. If I could just correct something, it's stream.org. Stream.org is where I write. Thank you.
Okay. I got the wrong info here.
That's okay.
I hate when that happens, but it's inevitable. All right, stream.org. Okay, good. I'm glad you corrected it. I want people to go to your website.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. So let's talk about Pope Francis. And I have not talked about this much. It's a huge item. And one reason is this is such a sensitive issue. I have criticized this Pope a lot. I just want you to have a little background here. My thesis is that mainstream Protestantism, non-Orthodox Judaism, and much of the Catholic Church has, including the Pope, is essentially its values are leftist more than any other thing, including Christian, Catholic, Protestant Catholic, or Jewish. So this is a terrible crisis for these three branches of biblical religion, I guess a good way to put it. And so I have spoken about the Pope. But on this particular issue, with regard to the charges against him made by Archbishop Carlo Vigano, who was the former papal nuncio, which means papal ambassador to the United States. He's a very high-ranking Catholic. About the Pope and covering up for abuse of children that he actually knew took place, and undid some of the punishments meted out by Pope Benedict. I wanted to speak to a Catholic, and so I'm speaking to you. So before you offer your ideas, give my audience a brief factual synopsis of where we're at.
Sure. A very high-ranking archbishop, the former Vatican ambassador to the U.S., has made a very specific and detailed list of charges about which bishops and which popes knew about sex abuse and cover-up. And he has said that the documents exist in the Vatican embassy in Washington, D.C. The U.S. could actually subpoena them, except they're protected by diplomatic immunity. And we've got a piece at stream.org where we call on President Trump to have the Justice Department subpoena those records and demand that the Vatican waive its diplomatic immunity, or with the U.S. should cut off diplomatic relations with the Vatican and send their ambassador home and pull our ambassador back. Because no more than, sometimes like you'll see Saudi UN representatives will be like using slaves in their Upper East Side apartments, and the U.S. will have to kick them out of the country because of what they're doing. Well, right now, it seems, if Vigano is telling the truth, there was a criminal conspiracy to cover up the sexual abuse of American citizens, some of them children, some of them like 18-year-old seminarians being harassed by the bishop who ran the seminary where they were, demanding that they get in bed with him. I mean, this is Harvey Weinstein stuff. Okay, imagine if Harvey Weinstein had been the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., and people were covering up the documents that said who knew when he was sexually abusing people and when. Cardinal McCarrick actually molested a child he had baptized as a baby. Think about that one.
How old was the child when he did this?
15. He stayed in touch with the family, stayed a family friend, and when he was 15, he started a sexual predatory relationship with someone he had held as a baby and baptized. That is one of the most staggeringly evil things I've ever heard. The current Archbishop of Washington, D.C., Donald Wuerl, is denying that he had any knowledge of this. Well, it's all there in the documents, and Pope Francis won't turn them over. Cardinal Wuerl won't turn them over. What they're doing is circling the wagons and attacking all the people asking questions, claiming that they're homophobes. The Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, Blaise Cupich, is also named in this accusation as being part of this. You could only call it a conspiracy that, like, the pedophile faction of the church apparently not only exists, but they were the ones who put Pope Francis on the throne. It was their votes in the conclave. It was their leadership. And after the conclave, he went and he lifted all the sanctions against clerics who'd been engaged in covering up for pedophiles. It's not just McCarrick. It's Cardinal Daniels of Belgium. Cardinal Wuerl was rewarded. All these, and left-right is not really important, but all these cardinals that Pope Francis has been appointing in the United States apparently are implicated in this ring of silence, of covering up for sex abuse. Maybe it's not true. There's one way to prove it. The documents are sitting there in Washington, D.C. The church is sitting on them. As a Catholic, I have very little hope that the church will release them without public pressure. So I would like to see President Trump make U.S. diplomatic relations with the Vatican conditional on the Vatican turning over these files to investigators from the Justice Department. I've heard that Attorney General Sessions is considering a RICO investigation of the U.S. Catholic bishops because they were shuffling these pedophile priests between different states.
Okay, I'm somewhat out of breath here. Let me ask you this: what is new in Archbishop Vigano's indictment?
Okay,
Vigano. I'm sorry, Vigano.
What's new is he asserts that he has personal knowledge that Pope Benedict tried to impose penalties on Archbishop Cardinal McCarrick. They weren't sufficient, but they were something, and that Pope Francis knew about it, and after accepting McCarrick's support to be elected Pope, reversed those sanctions and let McCarrick run around the world as a goodwill ambassador, go visit Africa, live in a seminary with young men, live near boys' schools, and basically let this predator run around as a goodwill ambassador for the church. He says Pope Francis knew it. He names other cardinals who knew it. He says there's documentary evidence. He's a whistleblower. People are trying to present him as some disgruntled, vicious man with an axe to grind. He's a whistleblower. And when people demonize the whistleblower, you have to wonder why. I really think this is like Watergate. And Pope Francis is right now, Richard Nixon, sitting in the White House trying to figure out who he can throw under the bus to save his own skin.
Saving his own skin means remaining Pope. Ross Douthat, writing, I believe Douthat is Catholic, writing in the New York Times, is as angry as you, but it says 2 resignations by popes in one millennium is too many.
Yeah, I think that's a mistake. I think it was a mistake for Benedict to resign.
Please. Listen. I just want to tell you.
Why he resigned? We're finding out why he resigned. He resigned a few days after receiving a 300-page dossier on how a network of sexual predators, mostly gay, had virtual control of the Vatican bureaucracy, that they were having cocaine-fueled orgies with underage male prostitutes in the Vatican palaces. Pope Benedict read that report, and it broke him. And he thought maybe a younger man could come and sweep it all out. What he didn't know was that the pedophile faction had already counted up their votes and were already ready to seize control of the papacy, and they still have it now. So, no, I think he needs to resign. Don't worry, George Soros will give him a very nice house to retire in somewhere in the south of France, probably.
I just want to say to my listeners, and you might find this of interest, I was very annoyed at Benedict for resigning. I thought he was a light in a dark age in Europe. He understood the battles that needed to be fought against the radical secularization of Europe, against radical Islam, and I did not understand at all why he retired. Even your explanation means that he was just naive on this matter. I will resign and therefore my successor will do more cleaning up than I can. I don't. It doesn't fully.
He was naive. Pope Benedict was naive. He was old. he'd been beaten down. Remember that when he was Pope, he was under incessant attack. He tried to, as best he could, to clean up this sex scandal, and he was attacked for it.
All right, hold on there. John Zmirak of Stream.org and The Politically Incorrect Guide to Catholicism, a great book.
I don't mind them switching sides and standing up for things they believe in. When they're running down a country man, they're walking on the fighting side of me.
All right, everybody, Dennis Prager here with John Zmirak. Very thoughtful writer. I had him on for his Politically Incorrect Guide to Immigration. And he's also written the Politically Incorrect Guide to Catholicism. By the way, I'd like to just add that those politically incorrect guides are superb. I have read a number of them. The Vietnam one was extraordinary, just extraordinary. And I salute Regnery. And full disclosure, they have published my book, The Rational Bible. So, but most of my books have been published by HarperCollins, so it has nothing to do with the fact that Regnery's published my latest book. They're just terrific. Question for you. How do you know that is why that this horrible description that you just described in the highest echelons of the Catholic Church with pedophile parties and the like, how do you know that that's why Benedict resigned?
I don't know for sure, but that's what Archbishop Vigano suggested, and I think he's a pretty good inside source.
Okay, I didn't realize that he had made that suggestion.
Yeah, he basically said that Pope Benedict despaired when he saw the extent of the libertine, sexually active, predatory gay mafia inside the Vatican itself. It was shortly after his personal butler had leaked a bunch of his own of private documents to the media. Pope Benedict felt surrounded and betrayed. He was constantly attacked in the media, whatever he did, just the way Pope Francis is fawned over whatever he does. And in Vigano's letter and in other news reports by people like George Neumeier and Michael Brendan Doherty, you can see that Pope Francis has a track record of covering up for sex abuse, reappointing people who've been credibly accused of sex abuse in Chile, in Argentina.
What animates him? What animates him in this regard, in your opinion?
What animated Cardinal Law? They think the institution of the church is more important than the innocence of children.
All right. So you think that's it, rather than a particular affinity for the pedophile gay priests?
Yeah, no, I think Pope Francis is using the gay lobby and using these people who are morally compromised because he has dirt on them. He can control them. They will follow his will. And I think his real agenda is sort of George Soros globalism with global institutions controlling the world economy, open borders, destroying capitalism. I think sexual morality, one way or the other, is of secondary interest to this Pope. Let me point out this. If Vigano is telling the truth, and the documents will tell the tale, at the same time Pope Francis was lifting any restrictions on Cardinal McCarrick, who molested the boy he had baptized. At the same moment he was lifting those restrictions, he was writing a document that condemned air conditioning as sinful. At the same time. So that tells you about his moral priority.
Well, I just read, tell me if it's accurate, because I'm very careful here, because there's so much on the internet that I always have to verify. What is the man's name? Kunich? Kupich. And is he a cardinal?
He was made a cardinal. He was plucked from obscurity in Washington, state of Washington. He was a bishop where he was not letting priests do pro-life activities. He was not letting them do the Latin Mass. He was supporting pro-gay priests. They found him. People like McCarrick found him, and Wuerl found him and gave his name to Pope Francis, who made him Archbishop of Chicago, one of the 2 or 3 most important jobs in America. Yeah, so Blaise Kupich.
Okay,
not very bright.
All right, well, okay. I don't know him from Adam, but I saw, tell me if you are familiar at all, that he said this is all, I'm paraphrasing, this is all nonsense. What really matters is global warming.
Yeah, he said that, and he said that Pope Francis's critics hate him because he's a Latino, and he described all this interest in, who was involved in covering up the rape of children. He said, well, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. And that just strikes me as an amazingly insensitive thing to say when we're talking about the rape of children. It's just disgusting.
This is a taboo question, and everybody knows, or anyone who listens knows. I mean, I have gay presenters at Prager University. I am the godfather to two children of a gay couple. So I have a pretty good, it's pretty clear where my heart is, and it is with everybody's created in God's image. So I'm not asking this as a hostile question, but
Sure.
But I think it's important. Do you have any idea what percentage of priestly child abuse was same-sex?
80%. And most of it was teenage boys. So we're not talking about clinical pedophilia. We're talking about, there's some segments of the gay community that think that cruising teenagers is okay, and apparently a lot of them became Catholic priests and bishops and cardinals.
Why did they? I mean, obviously this is conjecture.
Sure.
Did they do it because being a priest gave them good cover?
I think, and I'm rather cynical, I think the talented ones went to work on Broadway or for the Democratic Party, and the less talented members of the gay community found a very comfortable lifestyle in palatial homes with guaranteed incomes and very light workloads, and the opportunity to rise to the top in an
all right. We'll continue. John Zmirak, politically incorrect guide to Catholicism. Hi, everybody. Dennis Prager and John Zmirak, Z-M-I-R-A-K, who happens to be, he's not on because of the book, but I want to recommend the book anyway, Politically Incorrect Guide to Catholicism. He's obviously a committed Catholic, and he's a very powerful intellectual voice in a number of arenas. And again, your website is called stream.org?
That's right. We've got some good pieces covering the papal scandal right now. I've got a piece up there where I call for the government of Italy to demand the files on every cardinal so that they can keep cardinals who were involved in predatory behavior out of the nation of Italy. I think that would be very important. It could make sure that the next papal election, if Francis resigns or is somehow called home,
right, I want to talk to you about that.
The next papal election will not be dominated by the pedophile faction. I mean, I think the government
By the way,
has the right to know.
I think that we shouldn't use the word pedophile if overwhelmingly it was teenagers. It's terrible and evil.
I'm talking about people who covered up the sexual abuse of underage people. I'm using. It just has a nice sound to it. The correct term is ephebophilia. Do you really want me to use that?
No, but I think only because you may not agree with me. I believe there are levels of sin, and somehow between a 17 or a 15-year-old, it's awful in this regard. It's just evil. But a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old is double evil. That's all. So I want to be very careful. But anyway, and also people should know what happened. It's mostly teenage boys. That's
teenage boys and 20-year-old seminarians who were financially dependent on. They were living at the bishop's mercy. So it's a blend between. It's sort of in between Roman Polanski and Harvey Weinstein.
Do you think the Pope will resign?
No.
I don't think so either.
I think the only way would be if everywhere he goes, he is greeted by crowds that mock him and throw tomatoes at him, because he is a very, very proud, arrogant man. There's a great book also from Bergoglio called The Dictator Pope, and it chronicles his whole rise to power. It was very carefully calculated and cynically executed, and just how many people he ruined and how many people he manipulated in Argentina. This man is a
who wrote that book?
Juan Perón.
Who wrote the book?
Henry Sire. It's under a pseudonym, Marc Antonio Colonna. But just Dictator Pope, look it up, and it goes back all the way to when he was first a priest, and it shows where all the bodies are buried, figuratively, and how he rose to power in a quite cynical and calculated way. And I think it's quite cynical right now that the Pope is about to issue another document on the environment and on clean water.
Yeah, that's why they love him.
That is his response, and he's refusing to do the simple
Yeah.
thing. These documents exist in Washington, D.C. and the Vatican.
By the way, his answer
innocent,
on the papal airplane or his Aer Lingus was amazing. I mean, it's there. Read it. Okay, let me quickly take a call. Columbus, Ohio. Sherry, hi.
Hi, Dennis. Thank you for taking my call.
Thank you.
So I am a graduate in 1988 from a Catholic high school in the Pittsburgh Diocese that was greatly impacted by the headmaster, who was definitely, and I will say, a pedophile. And the reason that I say that word can definitely be used is because as children in the Catholic religion, we were all groomed by our parents, by our priests, by our leaders in the trust, and this is where we learned to trust the priests and we learned to trust our leaders. So, and I do believe that even as a teenager, when a grown man uses that trust and grooms and violates, that is still pedophilia. This has been such a hard thing for all of us. I was chatting with about 47 of the alumni from the high school last week, 2 of which remain Catholic at this time, and this is such an overwhelming sadness and angering event. It feels like a spiritual rape, even to those of us that were not directly molested by these men.
Well, I have a question, one final one, based on that, and I totally hear you. It has to be unbelievably painful for a faithful Catholic. But I do want to ask John, and I got to take a break, so you'll answer after the break if you would. The argument made by many, Catholic and non-Catholic, that this is a small percentage of Catholic priests. So I'd like you to address that. We will be back in a moment. All right, everybody, Dennis Prager here. I'm looking at the calls, and it's painful. I want you to know, if you're a faithful Catholic, my heart goes out to you. As much as any of us have any issues with clergy in our own faith, and we all do, I mean, they're human beings. To have the highest echelons of your faith act in such a way, or some of them, it's very, especially the Pope, it's a very distressing thing. I will deal next week with the issue of people leaving religion because of the actions of religious leaders. I want to defend staying in your faith, and I'll do that next week. John Zmirak, I asked you this question: how do you answer? And you're a faithful Catholic. How do you answer? Well, this is all horrible, but let's keep perspective. It's a very small percentage of priests. Is John there?
Yes.
Okay, I'm
Hello?
sorry. It was our fault here. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yes, it is a very small percentage of priests, and the incidence of child sex abuse among priests has plummeted since 2002. That's all true. This is not a scandal about your ordinary Catholic priest. There's no reason to be distrustful or hostile towards these priests. Most of them are wonderful, and the percentage of priests who offend against children is smaller than that of school teachers. That's not what this scandal is about. This is a bishop scandal. There is a very high percentage of bishops who covered up for sex abuse. That's what this is about. In 2002, when the bishops convened to deal with sex abuse, 2/3 of them were implicated in covering up. 2/3. Not one of them resigned. And in fact, when they wrote the document to deal with sex abuse, they specifically exempted bishops from any penalties. And do you know who made that change in the document? Cardinal McCarrick. That's what we're talking about. This is about bishops covering up sex abuse cases in order to protect the church's finances and their reputations. It's not about these ordinary priests doing hard work in dangerous parishes, often a very lonely job. I love the priests of the Catholic Church. Some of the best people, best men I've known in my life have been priests. This is not about priests being perverts. This is about bishops being criminals.
Okay, that's an important answer. So I just want to talk to you now about being a Catholic. Give an under 1 minute response to the Catholic who is now very troubled by his faith and might even consider leaving the church.
Yeah, I would say, I've struggled with that too, thanks to Pope Francis. I would say the devil attacks the things that are most important. He attacks motherhood in the form of abortion. He attacks marriage in the form of dismantling the institution legally. He's attacking Catholicism because it's the oldest, largest apostolic church going back to AD 33. And the devil's attack on it should be no surprise. And he's attacked it before, sometimes with great success. I would suggest sticking with it, and I think it's extremely hopeful that Archbishop Bergoglio came out and told us where all the bodies are buried and where the sticky fingerprints of corruption are. And I think you need to stay and bring these perverts down.
All right. I'm very glad I called on you, and I hope Tara in Minneapolis. I'm Catholic. We look at the Pope as infallible in his teaching, faith, and morals. I'm very upset. Actually, they're only infallible, Tara. I mean, this I know, on very, very, very few matters, and they are all doctrinal. And
Right.
If I'm not mistaken, it's only been invoked twice in Catholic history?
That's right. I mean, the best example is when Antonin Scalia wrote for the court majority, he was representing the authoritative interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. The rest of the time, when he talked on the golf course or gave a talk at a college, he did not have any of the authority of the Supreme Court. In the same way, the only times the popes have that negative protection is when they invoke it, and it's only happened for certain twice. It hasn't happened since 1950. On everything else, Pope Francis is no more beyond criticism than Harvey Weinstein or Paul Manafort. No disrespect intended to Mr. Weinstein or Mr. Manafort.
All right, John Zmirak. Good luck to you and his.
Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you. He has. I hope he continues, and same to you. Stream.org is his website. Author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Catholicism. I will deal. I need to deal with this next week. I will. Tomorrow's Friday. We don't have a lot of time because we have the happiness hour and open hour. But on people who are disappointed in their faith, what to do about it, I think I might be able to give you some intellectual responses. We've covered a lot of matters today. I don't want to take this call very much. I'm glad he's held on. Aaron in Brooklyn, New York. Hi.
Hey, Dennis. What's up, brother? How you feeling?
Really well, thank you.
Dennis, I don't want to hold up your time too much. I'm glad you even took it at 10 minutes left to the show. I just wanted to let you know that I'm a young black male in New York City, preferably Brooklyn, New York. And keep on what you guys are doing, because you totally changed my mind 100%. I'm switching from my Democratic Party to the Republicans, who seem to have more sense.
Well, you made my day.
Everything that's playing out in the news, the media, everything. If you just sit back, more than enough that those guys are having everybody cross over in due time.
I think that there is an awareness among Democrats that younger blacks are awakening to the fraud that the Democratic Party has pulled over blacks in America? That's the reason they are screaming racism, racism, racism as racism declines in an attempt to keep you. Aaron, you made my day. I'd like to keep this call. This is I do. I think that there is an awakening. There are reasons for optimism, folks, and I've never fooled you on the optimism-pessimism issue. PragerU is another reason for optimism. Please help us out. Whatever you give, 3 times the amount will be given. I want to thank Aaron in Brooklyn, and I'll tell you why I'm thanking him. I hope you're still listening. I assume you are. These are moments in American life that are worthy of note, and I think that Aaron represents a group, a growing group, but obviously not large, but growing. That's the key. And what happens, this is the way it works in life. The day your eyes open to whatever it might be, you can't go back. When a black American understands the fraud that the Democratic Party represents on race matters, that all they do is exacerbate, they try to exacerbate interracial tension based on the staggering lie that America's a racist society. And then, and the best example, I actually am happy that this happened. The DeSantis thing is a very important moment. The man says the last thing we need to do is to monkey this up by trying to embrace a socialist agenda with huge tax increases bankrupting the state. And a black professor of black studies goes on from Princeton University, goes on MSNBC and says this is a racist dog whistle. And the senator from Hawaii, Democrat, says this is racist. And I will get all the other names of these liars. And by the way, who don't know they're telling a lie. I don't know about the senator from Hawaii. I believe that some of these people believe their lies. And as I said, they're the most dangerous. I've studied good and evil my whole life. I have a fair grasp of the subject. People who believe lies are much more dangerous than people who don't. Anyway, I believe the absurdity is striking a number of young blacks as they find that actually things are getting better under the alleged racist president. It's like people who try to sell me on the notion, as a Jew, Richard Nixon was an anti-Semite because they heard him say anti-Jewish things on private tapes. However, Richard Nixon saved Israel's life in the Yom Kippur War. All right?
I just wanted to let you know that I'm a young black male in New York City, preferably Brooklyn, New York. And keep on what you guys are doing, because you totally changed my mind 100%. I'm switching from my Democratic Party to the Republicans, who seem to have more sense.
Yep, and decency. Okay, everybody. I'm Dennis Prager, and whatever you give to PragerU in this final 2 days is tripled.
The Dennis Prager Show, live from the Relief Factor Pain-Free Studio.
The Tom Woods Show, episode 1141.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Homeschooling parents, if you're running yourself ragged, it's time to switch to the self-taught Ron Paul curriculum. You get to keep your mental health, and your children will get an outstanding education. Plus, $160 worth of free bonuses when you join through my special link, ronpaulhomeschool.com. Hi, everybody. Tom Woods here. I did a little poll of folks in my Supporting Listeners Facebook group. You can join that, by the way, via supportinglisteners.com, about whether, if I were to cover this topic, should I make it a bonus episode or one of the regular episodes. And the consensus was that there's enough interest in this topic among the listeners that this ought to just be a regular episode of the show. Plus, I've got a bonus episode coming this weekend with Ben Settle, who's the greatest guy in the world, pretty much. So I decided to go ahead and do that. So the topic for today, therefore, is this very provocative book called The Dictator Pope, The Inside Story of the Francis Papacy, written by our guest today, Henry Sire. That's spelled S-I-R-E. Henry Sire is a British historian and Catholic author. His other books include The Knights of Malta, A Modern Resurrection, and Phoenix from the Ashes, The Making, Unmaking, and Restoration of Catholic Tradition. Henry, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Let's begin with a bit of the background here. This book, The Dictator Pope, originally came out under a pen name, and now here it is appearing in the United States via Regnery Publishing under your given name. Can you just explain those circumstances?
Well, the name of the book on the book is still the pen name, Mark Antonio Colonna. The only thing is that my real identity has been revealed.
I see. Okay, because of course I am looking at the cover right now. I thought there might be a newer version or something. So how did that happen? You didn't disclose it on your own, I presume?
No, Regnery disclosed it to Amazon about a month ago. It was always intended that my real identity should be disclosed when the print edition came out.
Ah, okay. So what was the idea behind the pen name to start with?
Well, a lot of people in Rome have suffered retaliation for criticism of Pope Francis. And I wanted to avoid that. But more particularly, I wanted to avoid retaliation on people who have been associated with me, or people whom who the Vatican might think have been associated with me, because I'm no longer living in Rome, and some of those people are.
This is quite astonishing. Of course, this runs contrary to the whole narrative about Pope Francis, the idea that you would live, if not in terror, then certainly in great discomfort at the prospect that he or his people or sympathizers might come after you. That's very much contrary to the smiling man who sets aside some of the traditional perks of the papal office. So anyway, we'll have time to talk about that. Let's talk about I guess we should start in Argentina. I do want to focus primarily on his years as Pope, but I did find it interesting to read the story about the Pope, of course, before becoming Pope, being a Jesuit in Argentina, who is being considered to be an auxiliary bishop of Buenos Aires, and he needs a special dispensation for that as a Jesuit. And there is a report that is written up about his character that has since disappeared. But what we have is the recollection of somebody who saw this report, and it is extremely unflattering and could help shed light on the kind of character we're observing in the Vatican today.
Yes, well, of course, the duty of the superior of the Jesuits, Father Kolbenbach, was to give his opinion on whether Bergoglio would be a suitable bishop. It wasn't to flatter him or to be unflattering. He was just called upon to show the character traits which would indicate whether Bergoglio was fitted to be a bishop or not, and his decision was absolutely contrary.
And some of the personality traits that are described, I mean, use of foul language, things like this just seem so unbecoming. But
let's be precise. Use of vulgar language.
Vulgar language. All right.
Let's not exaggerate things.
Okay, and I don't want to. I want to be as fair as I can, even though I find this whole experience to be so utterly exasperating. It's very difficult to maintain composure when discussing it. But in this story of Bergoglio as eventually Archbishop of Argentina, we're observing a man who, I guess earlier in his career, because of what you call his populist theology, was not viewed as a traditional leftist in the mold of some other churchman at the time, and was apparently his appointment was viewed with reasonable pleasure in conservative circles, and then he moves leftward.
Yes.
Can you describe how and why that happened?
Well, how it happened, he was appointed Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and gradually he began to abandon the defense of traditional Catholic orthodoxy for which he'd been known before, and present himself as a more liberal figure. Now, if you ask me why it happened, this is the great enigma of Bergoglio's career. The only explanation that I can think of, which is the one I give in the book, is that it was the last years of Pope John Paul II. It was assumed that the next pope was going to be a liberal. Moving into the liberal camp would put Bergoglio onto the winning side. If that's not the right explanation, I don't know of any more plausible one.
And yet he has filled these shoes so expertly, so effortlessly. It seems as if he's lived his whole life this way. But, of course, there have been other books written about Pope Francis by conservative Catholics who have complained about his political leanings, or they've complained about his movements in doctrine. Your focus, I want to make sure I don't drift too much into the subject matter of these other books. I do want to focus on his leadership and his style and things of that nature. So let me ask you about the question of him, Bergoglio as papabile. Presumably he was on the table, so to speak, as a candidate back when Ratzinger was elected. Were there people pushing for him even then?
Absolutely. The St. Gallen group chose him as their candidate back in 2005. They didn't succeed then, but they did succeed in 2013. It was the same people working for him both times.
What was his role in that? Now, he wasn't a member of this so-called St. Gallen Mafia, as it came to be known.
No, because they were Europeans, and he couldn't go to St. Gallen once a year as the others could to take part in their meetings. But
nevertheless, we must presume he's familiar with the existence of this group and sympathetic.
Well, certainly familiar with the individuals. I don't know to what extent he was aware of the goings on of the group, but there were cardinals such as Murphy O'Connor who quite openly said that they were supporting him for the papacy, and Bergoglio was well aware of that and accepted the candidacy.
Were there? I seem to recall, and I think it's in your book too, I seem to recall the impression that Bergoglio at the time was giving the impression that it was very much against his will that he would go to Rome and this and that, while at the same time he seems to have been engaging in machinations of his own behind the scenes. What's the truth to that?
Yes, well, this is one of the things I quote from a very revealing book, El Verdadero Francisco by Omar Bello, an Argentinian. He quotes a priest who's a friend of Bergoglio in the run-up to the 2013 election, saying, Bergoglio is saying, he can't be bothered to go to Rome, he's old, he's tired, and I know that he's plotting like mad. Well, that's Jorge, says his friend. And, this is the response of somebody who knows him well.
When we start to talk about the papacy, the pontificate of Francis, and we look at some of the decisions made, sometimes personnel decisions, for example, in some of the Roman dicasteries, it seems as if sympathizers of the old regime, and in this case, the old regime is the Benedict XVI regime, which by the standards of Cardinal Ottaviani, even the Benedict XVI regime would have been considered liberal.
You're right.
But he's removing people, particularly like around the Congregation for Worship, and replacing them with obvious sympathizers. Do you feel as if the leadership style of Bergoglio is driven simply by his, frankly, authoritarian nature, or is it authoritarianism linked with an ideology?
Yes, the latter. It is authoritarianism linked with ideology. Clearly, he wants to surround himself with people who are going to support his revolution in the church.
Now, what about some of the cardinals who voted for him, who were not, of course, the vast bulk of them are not in this small St. Gallen group. I am inclined to think that a number of these cardinals probably voted for him because maybe they are a bit to the left of center, or they just heard that he is very, very concerned about the poor, and that appealed to them. But I wonder how many of them, it's impossible to know, may feel like they have a case of buyer's remorse at this point.
Oh, I think most of them have. But I don't think it was a question of concern for the poor. The real concern in 2013 was reform in Rome. There had just been a secret report that had been delivered to Pope Benedict showing an appalling state in the Roman Curia. And everybody knew that the finances of the Vatican badly needed reform. And basically, the people who voted for Bergoglio saw him as a reformer. I don't think the question of concern for the poor came into it much.
So when he becomes Pope, of course, we have the highly unusual situation of having Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. This whole situation is extremely bizarre, and it got much more so probably within the past month or 6 weeks with that whole episode where the Vatican had doctored a photograph of a letter Benedict had written,
yes,
appearing to endorse the Francis papacy far more than he actually had. This is very disturbing. And yet, even though Francis is clearly moving very systematically and, if I may say so, mercilessly to undo much of the Benedict legacy, it's interesting that although Benedict feels like he can occasionally say a little something, he's been mostly silent. And all he would have to do, if you ask me, is somewhere offer the Mass according to the liturgical books of 1962, and that would say to the world all that needs to be said, yet he won't do that.
I don't know about that. Do you know that Pope Benedict doesn't say the Old Mass?
I think he probably does in his private quarters, but certainly he's not going to be disapproved to say a Mass publicly wherever he wants to. If he had a big public Mass in the Old Rite, and as I say, I think in his private Masses he does use the Old Rite, that would be saying something in an age of a pope who has sympathy and mercy for everybody in the world, except traditional Catholics who want the old Mass, who are attached to a fad and whom he takes none of the pastoral care to understand that he extends to everybody else on earth.
You're absolutely right, yes.
So I think Benedict XVI remains a big puzzle and mystery here. Do you have any insights, by the way, into the question of his resignation? Should we really take it at face value?
I think basically it was that Benedict had been there in Rome in the last years of John Paul II, when he was really not capable of governing the church properly. And Benedict was determined that the same should not happen again. Now, on top of that came what I referred to just now, this awful report about the dreadful corruption in the Vatican. And Benedict just felt that he was too old to cope with it himself, and he wanted the election of a younger man who would be able to cope.
Let's say something, if we could, about the synods on the family, because this is really where so much of the controversy surrounding him has arisen, even though you wouldn't have to be confined to those synods to find material that's objectionable. You can listen to the interviews the Pope gives. You can listen to his Angelus addresses. I mean, it's just a font of bizarre statements that wind up, half of them have to be clarified by L'Osservatore Romano the next day. And I know this sounds flippant, but I say to myself, whoever the official clarifier is at the L'Osservatore Romano, why don't we cut out the middleman and make that guy the Pope, and it'd be a lot less confusing for everybody. But all the same, these synods on the family seem to have been carried out with an iron fist in the background.
Oh, yes. It was very much political control, rigging the synod so that the liberals were in a majority. And the whole procedure was directed towards relaxing church teaching on the family and on chastity.
I was particularly interested in this story, which I recall at the time, of Cardinal Casper, who is known to be on the left who had rather disparaging things to say about the African hierarchy, saying, going so far as to say, they shouldn't say too much about what it is we need to do, that they're committed to backward taboos and things like that. And when a journalist reported these remarks, and the African bishops were quite horrified that he had been saying such disparaging things, Cardinal Casper apparently at first denied having said it, and then the journalist presented a recording of his words, and then he had to apologize. This is a prince of the church who openly lies. I mean, yes. Who knows what he does in secret?
Yes, you're absolutely right. But this is typical of liberal superiority. They regard themselves as an elite who are the only ones who properly understand how Catholicism ought to be interpreted. And, they are there to dispense their wisdom to the rest of the church.
I'd like to get your thoughts, I'm sure you're going to run into this question quite a bit, on Cardinal Burke, who had been in charge of the Roman Rota. So if we're talking about the legal system of the church, this is a very significant position. And then he was clearly and obviously demoted by Pope Francis in what could not possibly be mere coincidence. And now he occupies a very interesting position now, because even though he has been demoted, in a way, all eyes are on him, because he has been, well, as outspoken as a cardinal on the right generally has been. I mean, there have been cardinals on the left who have been unhappy with the previous couple of popes, but on the right, they generally stay quiet. So it's a bit unusual for somebody like Burke to have emerged.
Well, Cardinal Burke is saying what he has always said. He's speaking out on Catholic doctrine as it's always been understood. The exceptional thing is that under the present papacy, he's regarded as an extremist.
And that's what's changed in just a matter of a few years. Now, the concern that I think some people have is that you could imagine, for example, in the American case, maybe you have one bad president. Now, I don't know. I think you have a whole bunch of them. But let's suppose you had one. There's no reason that the next president couldn't undo what the first one did. The trouble here is that the Pope chooses the very people who are going to vote to replace him. And the question is the influence that now Francis wields over the College of Cardinals. That is to say, how many members of the College of Cardinals are direct appointees of Pope Francis? How many more are coming? And depending on how long this pontificate goes on, as the Francis Cardinals pile up, it's Katie bar the door, so to speak.
Yes, of course. One can't guarantee who one's successor is going to be. The last similar case was with John the 23rd, who managed to appoint more than half the Sacred College in the brief 5 years that he was Pope. Even so, and he intended Cardinal Montini to succeed him, but even so, the election of Cardinal Montini wasn't a foregone conclusion. Cardinals are not necessarily going to follow the line of the Pope who appointed them. Many of them have a mind of their own.
Well, that's true, but it seems to me that when you're trying to carry through a revolution, which Francis clearly is, you're not going to be as, let's say, well, let's think of it this way. John Paul II appointed some people who I can't understand why in the world he would want to appoint them. And on the other hand, sometimes he appointed perfectly good people. Whereas when you have just a revolutionary who is single-minded, he's not going to be that way. He's going to find people who want to carry forth the revolution. He's not going to say, well, in the interest of fair play, let me make sure all interests in the church are represented. I just don't see that happening. I think it's much more likely that he's going to bring about a college that's going to replace him with a Francis II. Now, of course, we have to wait and see. We can't know that. Now, a lot of this stuff, though, when you talk about it, will seem like, well, this is just, this is some obscure Catholic argument that's going on about the inner workings of the church. But I'd like to know, from your book, could you describe maybe 2 or 3 incidents that you think most capture the, as you put it, the dictatorial nature of this pontificate?
Well, as far as the dictatorial nature goes, there was the well-known case of 3 officials of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith being dismissed in person by Pope Francis. And in general, you have the atmosphere of fear that exists in the Vatican, because nobody knows when the same may not happen to them. But when I depicted Pope Francis as a dictator, I wanted to draw attention to his background in Argentina, the way he is a political pupil of the dictator Perón, and indeed he showed his dictatorial tendencies when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires too.
I recall an episode, now I can't remember the name of the journalist, but he's a very, very well-known Italian observer of the Vatican who had written something critical about the Pope, and he wound up getting a telephone call from Francis himself in which, according to all accounts, the Pope thanked him and said that he needs to hear criticism, and he knows that this criticism was offered in a spirit of love for the Church, and he appreciates it. So we do have an episode like that. So somebody could cite that against you and say, well, look, that's a very generous act. Maybe previous popes wouldn't have done that with their enemies.
Well, if I receive a telephone call from Pope Francis saying that, I'll be extremely edified.
I'd like to get you back on the show after that call comes in, as a matter of fact.
I'll let you into the secret, yes.
But, I hear cases of, religious orders being attacked, and of course, we can't know all the circumstances. Sometimes there could just be rot and corruption all the way through a religious order that on the face of it looks very orthodox and vibrant. And so we can't know all the circumstances. So we do have to reserve a bit of judgment in cases like that. But given that there is corruption and rot all over the world, and yet it seems as if there's a targeted attack only on, or primarily on, orders that tend to be most orthodox, it doesn't seem unreasonable to think there's an agenda at work here. Now, can you give us any stories about this kind of thing?
Well, what you say is absolutely right. The prime example of a religious order which has suffered is the Franciscans of the Immaculate.
Right.
Now, nobody could accuse them of corruption. What they suffered for was their decision to return to the old liturgy. And they were treated in a very tyrannical way by the man appointed to visit them. And I draw the contrast between the way they were treated and the treatment of the legionaries of Christ, who, there you have a clear case of corruption. The founder of that order was an appalling man. This was discovered towards the end of his life. He was guilty of all sorts of sins, and yet the Legionaries of Christ were handled with kid gloves. The big difference between them and the Franciscans of the Immaculate is that the Legionaries of Christ have a lot of money, and the Franciscans of the Immaculate were a prime example of a genuine vocation of poverty.
What about what happened with the Order of Malta? There was some intervention regarding a personnel matter. I'm sorry, I don't remember the details of that incident, but it does seem to fit, and I know you treat it in the book, it does seem to fit this mold.
Yes, but I mean, there was no real issue of corruption there. There was something that was done wrong, which was the distribution of condoms in the charitable works of the order. And the Grand Master attempted to correct that, and he wanted to dismiss the official who had been responsible during the years that it happened. What happened was that Pope Francis then stepped in, forced the Grand Master to resign, and reinstated the man who had been responsible for the condom distribution. Well, this doesn't send a very good signal about Pope Francis's devotion to Catholic moral teaching.
Well, that's true. I think it's more the question of the way these things are carried out. I mean, I'm pretty sure that the intervention there was, I don't know, in defiance of established procedure or something like that?
Oh, certainly. Clearly, whenever the Pope asks the head of a religious order to resign, that will be a completely exceptional intervention. Actually, what was more illegal, what was totally illegal, was the intervention of the Secretariat of State, where they declared the acts of the Order of Malta invalid, the government of the Order of Malta invalid. Now, the status of the Order of Malta was defined by a document issued by the Vatican itself in 1953, and it declared that the authority with competence over the Order of Malta is the Congregation for Religious. It didn't attribute any authority over the order to the Secretariat of State. So Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State, was acting completely illegally in intervening in that way.
How would you contrast with specific examples the style then of Francis with his two immediate predecessors? I could imagine, again, a casual observer thinking that John Paul II was some kind of authoritarian. Most people believe that, by the way. They believe he was an authoritarian. I don't see that at all. I think he treated almost everyone with kid gloves, with relatively few exceptions. But how would you respond to people if you were to try to explain the difference between Bergoglio and not just a whole bunch of his predecessors, but the two most people living today are most familiar with?
Well, what distinguishes Pope Francis is his complete disregard for the rules. This applies to law, canon law. It applies to theology. Francis goes in with the attitude, I don't bother about this. And this is what sets him completely apart from Pope Benedict, who was, of course, very much aware of the doctrinal heritage that he was called upon to uphold, and also from John Paul II, who wanted to do things also in a legal way. So we have a completely new phenomenon in the papacy now.
Meanwhile, we have Cardinal Burke, who was part of a group of 4 cardinals, 2 of whom I believe are now deceased.
Yes. Who
were proposing so-called dubia to the Pope, that these are statements they want clarification on in light of, particularly the document Amoris Laetitia, and they want an answer, because one thing the Pope is good at is ambiguity or plausible deniability. I never said X in so many words.
Yes.
But footnote 87 seems to say X. The flowery document seems okay in some particulars, but that footnote, so they want some clarification on it. I don't know. Now there are only 2 of them in the whole world. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, at the same time, I guess we should recall that at the time of the English Reformation, only John Fisher stood up and said, alone among the hierarchy, stood up and said something's wrong here. But to see so few cardinals be willing to say we need to get answers on these fundamental questions, I wonder what Cardinal Burke's next move really is. He's been talking about a formal correction of Pope Francis. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Cardinal Burke is in an extremely difficult situation. Of course, probably the main object in Francis's intervention in the Order of Malta was to undermine Cardinal Burke as patronus of the order. So Cardinal Burke has been left isolated. It's much more difficult for him to act now than it was 2 years ago. I'm really not in a position to advise Cardinal Burke how to act. But what I would say is all Catholic prelates and clergy who are concerned about the way Pope Francis is behaving need to show that concern when the occasion arises. It may be a document like Amoris Laetitia, or it may be this recent apparent pronouncement of the Pope saying that there's no such thing as hell, no eternal punishment. Whenever anything like that happens, it is necessary for Orthodox Catholics to say, this is completely unacceptable, because otherwise Pope Francis is going to think that he can just do whatever he likes.
And it doesn't help that both Catholics and non-Catholics alike think papal infallibility means if the Pope's favorite color is green, then yours had better be green. I mean, this is not even remotely what it means, but I think somebody like Francis has exulted again in the ignorance of the public on questions like this, because when the Pope speaks, everybody assumes this is authoritative and this is the very embodiment of Catholic teaching, and that's been the source of, that I think is how they carried through the post-Vatican II revolution. They took advantage of the fact that they knew that traditional, normal Catholics would, in a spirit of obedience, go along with what they were told, because these are their superiors in whom they must repose their confidence. And boy, was a lot of mischief carried out as the result of that. Now, you have a site up with some interesting bullet points from the book, dictatorpope.com, that people can check out. The book, of course, is The Dictator Pope, The Inside Story of the Francis Papacy. I will also link to it at tomwoods.com/1141 for today's episode. And Henry Sire, thanks for your time today.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.